Today marks a special day for PC gamers, the return of the $250 US graphics card, and what we're getting here from Intel looks pretty good. That's right, it's Intel who is apparently saving PC gaming by delivering a GPU that's faster than both the GeForce RTX 4060 and Radeon RX 7600 while costing less, and crucially packing more VRAM, 12GB instead of just 8. This new graphics card is called the Arc B580. It's based on the new Xe2 architecture and it's designed for 1440p gaming. The highlights of the Xe2 architecture include the second generation Xe core with SIMD 16 execution, offering major efficiency improvements, a new and improved ray tracing unit offering 2 times the throughput, and second generation XMX engines. In terms of specifications, the B580 has been manufactured using TSMC's 5N process, packing 19.6 billion transistors into a 272 square millimeter die. In total, there are 20 Xe cores, 160 Xe vector engines, 160 XMX matrix engines, 20 RT units, 160 TMUs, and 80 ROPs. The cores come clocked at 2,670 MHz but can boost as high as 2,850 MHz. The memory subsystem includes 12GB of GDDR6 memory running at 19 gigabits per second on a 192-bit wide memory bus, resulting in a memory bandwidth of 456 GB per second. The board power rating has been set at 190 watts and it uses a PCIe 4.0x8 interface. On hand for testing, we have the Intel Arc B580 limited edition graphics card, though we do have a few AIB models on hand, though we can't test those for another 24 hours. The limited edition model uses Intel's signature stealth black design, and this is a dual fan model. The PCB is very compact, so the second fan blows through the card. As for testing, we're using our updated GPU test system featuring the Ryzen 7 9800X3D, so all of the data featured in this video is new, it's all up to date, and has been collected over the past week. There's loads of data to go over, so let's get into it. We'll start with Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and at 1080p, the B580 looks quite good, beating the RTX 4060 by a 7% margin, and the RX 7600 by a 10% margin. It was 5% slower than the 6700 XT and 7% slower than the RTX 3060 Ti though. Still, if we increase the resolution to 1440p, we're looking at 51 FPS using the maximum in-game quality settings, so that's without upscaling enabled. And this was enough to match the 6700 XT, and that meant it was now 16% faster than the 4060 and 19% faster than the 7600, so very impressive margins there. Next up, we have a Plague Tale Requiem, and here the B580 looks great, rendering 77 FPS at 1080p. This meant it was 18% faster than the 7600 and 20% faster than the 4060, and really it wasn't that much slower than the 4060 Ti. The 1440p results are much the same. The B580 was 21% faster than the 7600 and 24% faster than the 4060. Performance overall wasn't amazing with just 56 FPS on average, but again we are using the highest quality preset and it is possible to enable upscaling to boost the frame rates above 60 FPS. Now, Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty hasn't been tested using the highest possible quality preset, instead we've gone with the high preset and then disabled upscaling, so we're testing at the native 1080p resolution. Under these conditions, the B580 was able to render 90 FPS, which is an 11% improvement over the 7600 and 15% over the 4060. That also placed it on par with the 6700 XT and 3060 Ti. Now at 1440p, it does even better relative to competing parts, and is very close to the 4060 Ti, rendering 63 FPS. That made it 19% faster than the 7600 and a massive 29% faster than the 4060. So incredibly impressive results here, and a quick side note, we're not using the built-in benchmark for measuring performance in Cyberpunk 2077, rather we are testing in-game. Another game where Intel's new B580 looks impressive is Dying Light 2. Here we're again looking at 4060 Ti-like performance, delivering 74 FPS at 1080p. This made it 17% faster than the 4060 and 21% faster than the 7600. Then quite remarkably at 1440p, the B580 managed to nudge ahead of the 4060 Ti, albeit by a single frame, so the same performance overall, but for a $250 US graphics card, this is very impressive. And as a result, it was 25% faster than the 4060 and 34% faster than the 7600. So yeah, a super result here. The B580 did stumble a little in Dragon Age, the Veilguard, and while it did match the 6700 XT, which would normally be really impressive, it was 15% slower than the 4060, and we're looking at just 52 FPS on average at 1080p. So not great performance overall, but similar to what we're seeing from comparable Radeon GPUs in this title. However, something a little odd about the B580 is that it often scales very differently across resolutions when compared to the Radeon and GeForce GPUs, and we're getting a look of that here. Increasing the resolution to 1440p only reduced the B580's performance by 17%, whereas the RTX 4060 saw a 37% performance hit, and as a result is now slightly slower than the B580. Now, a big reason for this is down to VRAM. Though that doesn't explain everything, as the B580 should scale better at 1080p, but at 1440p, the RX 7600 does run out of VRAM, resulting in very poor performance. The 8GB GeForce GPUs, they don't suffer as much, but the 8GB 4060 Ti was still up to 11% slower than the 16GB model. Chances are, if we played the game beyond the period of time that it takes to run our benchmarks, the 8GB GeForce GPUs would suffer more. Anyway, the fact that the B580 has 12GB of VRAM, it does help it here, not only to deliver better average frame rate performance, but also more consistent frame times. Next up we have War Thunder, and here the B580 works well, though it is only 5% faster than the 7600 and 7% faster than the 4060. On the other hand though, it was able to match the 7700 XT and 3060 Ti, and we see a bit more separation at 1440p, as here the B580 is 11% faster than the 7600 and 16% faster than the 4060, so overall great performance from Intel's latest Arc GPU. Next up we have Spider-Man Remastered, and I had to triple check this data because the B580 just looked far too good, rendering 152 FPS on average at 1080p in our test, which is comparable performance to the 4060 Ti, and we have seen this already, but in this example, that made it almost 70% faster than the 4060 and almost 50% faster than the 7600. And what's interesting about this is that the margins were actually reduced at 1440p. And this is the first time we're actually seeing this. Still, even here the B580 was 43% faster than the 4060 and 47% faster than the 7600, so amazing results overall. The B580 wasn't nearly as impressive in Hogwarts Legacy, matching the performance of the 4060 at 1080p with 71 FPS, and this meant it was 7% slower than the RX 7600. Still, performance overall is decent using the high quality preset, and the B580 does scale a little bit better at 1440p, as it's now able to match the 7600, making it 11% faster than the 4060. Sadly, the Space Marine 2 performance at 1080p isn't great, and although 62 FPS on average is very playable, it does mean that the B580 is 16% slower than the 4060 and 18% slower than the 7600, so very disappointing data in that respect. And here we have another example where the B580 drops only a small amount of performance when increasing the resolution to 1440p, and as a result, in this example, it is able to nudge ahead of the RTX 4060. Still not amazing performance, but given the price, it is passable. Moving on to The Last of Us Part 1 at 1080p, we find pretty strong performance from the B580 with 75 FPS on average, and that meant it was 10% faster than the 4060 and 14% faster than the 7600. Then at 1440p using the ultra quality preset, in the section of the game that we use for testing, you will run into performance issues with 8GB of VRAM. Although the average frame rate looks fine, you will often see horrible frame stuttering, which smashes the 1% lows down, like what you're seeing here. So while the B580 is an impressive 29% faster than the 4060 when comparing the average frame rate, it's 110% faster when comparing 1% lows. It's also worth noting that with 54 FPS on average, the B580 is able to deliver playable performance. Next up, we have Star Wars Outlaws, and with the initial review driver, we had a lot of stability issues in this title, but thankfully, before the release, Intel was able to roll out a new driver which solved these issues, and that allowed me to test Outlaws without any problems. So with that solved, the B580 was 18% faster than both the 4060 and 7600, so a great result here, though we are only looking at 40 FPS at 1080p. So you'd have to lower the quality preset and/or enable upscaling. And that being the case, 1440p is really out of the question, so you will need to lower the quality settings in this title, but that was obviously also the case for most of the graphics cards tested here. Last up we have Starfield, and the B580 didn't perform that well here, at least in the section of the game that we use for testing. Not only was the average frame rate quite low, coming in 20% lower than that of the RTX 4060 for example, but the frame time performance was also quite poor, and this is the same issue we've seen in the past with the A770. Given what we saw at 1080p, 1440p is obviously out of the question, not just because of the weak frame time performance, but also because we're looking at just 30 FPS on average, not exactly a great gaming experience. Okay, so here's a look at the 12 game average performance at 1080p, and as you can see, the B580 stacks up quite well, delivering on average 7% greater performance than the RTX 4060 and 8% greater performance than the RX 7600. Certainly not mind-blowing margins by any stretch of the imagination, and it is worth noting that the 7600 and 4060 have been out in the wild for a year and a half now, and are expected to be replaced sometime within the next 6 months. So while the B580 looks good for $250 US, it is competing with much older products. All of that said, it does perform much better relative to the 7600 and 4060 at 1440p, delivering 14% greater performance than the 4060 and 21% greater performance than the 7600. That placed it alongside the RTX 3060 Ti and just ahead of the 6700 XT, which I'd say is pretty great performance for the asking price. Now in terms of power consumption, the B580 isn't amazing, but it's also not bad. In Star Wars Outlaws, for example, it consumed 22% more power than the 4060, which worked out to be a 49 watt increase. It was 8% faster in this example, which helps, but of course the GeForce GPU is still more power efficient. In Starfield, we're looking at just a 16% power increase over the 4060, as here the B580 consumed roughly the same amount of power as the RX 7600, though the 4060 was also 23% faster in this example, so not a good title for the B580 in terms of efficiency. Then finally, we have some power usage numbers in Space Marine 2, and here the B580 consumed 27% more power than the 4060, which equates to a 56 watt increase. The B580 was 6% faster though. Now just quickly before we move on, here's a look at how the Intel Arc B580 limited edition graphics card runs under load. Testing takes place inside an enclosed ATX case with a room temperature of 21 degrees, and here the B580's GPU peaked at just 62 degrees, with a peak memory temperature of 70 degrees. The cores ran at 2850 MHz, and we typically saw a fan speed of between 1250 and 1350 RPM. So under load, the card ran very cool and quiet. Okay, so it's time to take a look at some ray tracing performance, and for this we have 6 games, all of which have been carefully selected. Tim spent a few months testing the effectiveness of RTFX in a broad range of titles, and found games such as Metro Exodus Enhanced, Alan Wake 2, Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, Black Myth Wukong, and Dying Light 2 Stay Human were amongst the best to showcase the technology, offering what Tim called better overall to transformative visuals. Now, for all of this testing, I will be using quality upscaling at 1080p and 1440p, so that means DLSS for the NVIDIA graphics cards that support it, and then FSR for the Radeon GPUs, and then any GeForce GPUs that don't support DLSS. And then finally, we have XeSS for the Arc GPUs. So let's see how the B580 handles ray tracing, but 53% faster than the 7600. I really expected the B580 to be very crippled in Alan Wake 2, to the same degree as the 7600 for example, but it managed respectable performance relative to the RTX 4060. Of course, these settings, which we deem transformative, can't really be run on these graphics cards. Even the 4060 was only able to average 30 FPS, and that's with quality DLSS enabled. So while Alan Wake 2 is a good example of a game with excellent ray tracing, it sadly cannot be enjoyed on a current generation Nvidia GPU that costs less than $600 US. And that being the case, 1440p is obviously completely out of the question, but since we have the data, here it is. Even the RTX 4070 is highly questionable here. Now for Cyberpunk 2077, the minimum acceptable ray tracing quality setting is Ultra, which Tim claimed generally offers better overall image quality, while the Overdrive mode is transformative. But there's simply no chance you can run the Overdrive mode on an RTX 4060 tier product. So I've had to settle with the generally better visual option in Ultra ray tracing. At 1080p, the B580 was actually faster than the RTX 4060, rendering 58 FPS on average, and that's a 14% performance boost. It's near enough to 60 FPS, which some people will be happy with, though having to use upscaling at a low resolution such as 1080p is suboptimal, I'd say. Then at 1440p, it's a real struggle, but relative to the 4060, the B580 is impressive, rendering 41 FPS, which made it nearly 60% faster. Now for testing Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, we have maxed out the visuals, including the ray tracing options, as Tim says this leads to a generally better overall presentation when compared to no ray tracing at all. Oddly, however, the B580 was the slowest GPU tested here, rendering just 67 FPS, making it 20% slower than the RTX 4060, so a very disappointing result there. But if we increase the resolution, the B580 sees almost no change in performance, and as a result is now just 12% slower than the 4060. As unusual as these results are, they have been confirmed by Intel, and at the point of putting this review together, they didn't have an answer for me as to why we're seeing this odd scaling behavior with the B580. Black Myth Wukong was unstable on the B580 with the initial review driver, but Intel was again able to solve this before reviews went live with a new driver update. So we were able to complete our testing without any crashes, but unfortunately with very high quality ray tracing enabled, which Tim claims generally looks better overall, none of these sub $400 US GPUs were able to deliver acceptable performance. So the fact that the 4060 was 84% faster than the B580 is largely irrelevant here. And that being the case, there's really no need to go over the 1440p results, but since I have the data, here it is, you can have a quick look. Next, we have Dying Light 2 using the high ray tracing preset, which we believe generally looks better overall, and here the B580 was able to average 62 FPS, making it 11% faster than the 4060 and 41% faster than the 7600, so a great result here for Intel. Then at 1440p, we're looking at 45 FPS, which isn't a great experience in my opinion, especially given we're already using upscaling. Still, the B580 was 18% faster than the 4060 and 67% faster than the RX 7600. Now, here's the 6-game average for the ray tracing results at 1080p, and on average, the B580 was 20% slower than the 4060, but 55% faster than the RX 7600. But a lot of this data has to be taken with a grain of salt, because the RTX 4060 was unusable in my opinion in some of the games tested, even at 1080p, games such as Alan Wake 2 and Black Myth Wukong for example. Then at 1440p, the B580 was 18% slower than the RTX 4060, but in games such as Alan Wake 2, Cyberpunk 2077, Dying Light 2 and Black Myth Wukong, the GeForce GPU was rendering well below 60 FPS on average, and that's with quality DLSS enabled, so not a great experience there. Okay, so now it's time for the all-important cost per frame data, and this is where the ARC B580 really shines, thanks to its $250 US MSRP. Based on the 1440p data, the B580 is coming in at a 24% discount per frame when compared to the RX 7600 and 27% when compared to the RTX 4060. Now, prior to the release of the B580, Tim and myself agreed that if Intel could achieve a 20% discount relative to the RTX 4060, it would be a success. So given we're seeing over a 20% discount here, it's looking like the B580 will be a success. But first, let's take a look at real-world retail pricing. Even at current retail pricing, the B580 is still 21% cheaper than the 7600 per frame, and the same 27% discount relative to the RTX 4060 applies. So if you were to go out and buy an ARC B580 graphics card at launch, you'd be getting yourself a great deal in my opinion. I think it's fair to say the B580 is a great value graphics card, certainly in the current market, and the cost per frame data clearly shows that it's at least 20% better value than competing parts. And only some of that data takes into account the fact that you're getting 50% more VRAM. Measuring the value of additional VRAM can be difficult, as short benchmark passes often don't expose VRAM capacities that are right on or just over the limit. They also don't account for games that reduce texture quality, and in fact, in some of those examples, the performance can actually increase on models with insufficient VRAM. But what I can tell you is this, going from 8GB to 12GB of VRAM is invaluable, and it will make the B580 significantly more capable than either the RX 7600 or RTX 4060 moving forward. So if you factor that into the equation, the B580 really is significantly better value than anything AMD or Nvidia have to offer right now. In terms of stability, the B580 was good. Not flawless in our testing, but certainly good enough given the price. I'm also a lot less concerned with stability and compatibility, given the improvements Intel's made over the years. And even during the review process, most of the issues that we ran into were solved before the reviews were set to go live. All of that said, you're more likely to run into issues with the B580 than you are with an RX 7600 or RTX 4060, which is why we believe a 20% discount is warranted, and Intel has certainly delivered that. I also don't think power consumption is an issue here. Using around 50 watts more than the RTX 4060 isn't ideal, but it's far from a deal breaker, again given the large discount on offer here. Likewise, I'm not too fussed with the ray tracing performance of the B580. Intel have claimed that it is meant to be better than the RTX 4060, and look, that could well be the case in titles that don't heavily use RTFX, and there are plenty of those. In fact, it is really the vast majority. But for games that do generally look better with RT enabled, or better yet can be considered transformative, the RTX 4060 is generally the faster option. But it also generally sucks in terms of performance, so ray tracing really shouldn't be a priority for really any graphics cards that cost less than $600 US. As it stands, if you're in the market for a graphics card and want to spend less than $300 US, your options are extremely limited, and they have been for quite some time. For the longest time, the RX 6600 has been the go-to option, but with just 34 FPS on average at 1440p in our 12-game sample, the B580 was almost 70% faster. So paying around 30% more while getting 50% more VRAM is well worth it, and really you wouldn't entertain the RX 6600 anymore. For those of you who want to game at 1440p, the RX 6600 will have to use medium to low quality settings, so I feel with the arrival of the B580, AMD really can't charge more than about $130 US for the 6600. Likewise, to compete with the B580, the RX 7600 needs to drop down to $200, and even then it wouldn't be all that compelling given that it only has 8GB of VRAM. I think $180 would be a more attractive price point, so that's pretty bad news for AMD. They need to slash prices by at least 30%. Likewise, the RTX 4060 needs to drop from the current $300 US asking price down to $200 US at most, and I really can't see that happening. Therefore, for entry-level gaming, the B580 is now the new go-to option. It's really impossible to recommend anything else. So great job there, Intel. They've achieved with their second generation what they failed to do with their first. And on that note, in my opinion, Intel has to fully commit to ARC at this point, as in the discrete desktop GPUs. Over the years, there's been a lot of talk suggesting Intel will axe discrete desktop GPUs after the initial Battle Mage release, so parts like the B580, and I'm not saying this won't happen, but what I am saying is this would be an epic fail on Intel's behalf if they choose to do so. In my opinion, things with ARC have been heading in the right direction, and while they have a long way to go, giving up now would be a disaster. And on a final note, Intel does have the B570 coming in the next month for $220 US, and that model packs a 10GB VRAM buffer. And that being the case, I expect that the B580 will be worth the small $30 US premium. So if you like what you've seen here, it's probably not worth waiting. On that note, the only concern I have right now is availability. I've talked with a few retailers and they've all told me that pre-sales for the B580 have been unexpectedly high, selling all of the stock they were able to get their hands on. So it seems even prior to the reviews, people were excited to get a graphics card that Intel claims is faster than RTX 4060 for $250 US with 12GB of VRAM. So, given how good Intel's B580 is, availability for at least a few months is probably going to be very limited. It's what you might call a high-class problem though for Intel, but for buyers it's going to be quite annoying. Anyway, it's great to finally have a sub $300 US graphics card worth recommending, and I'm keen to see how Intel develops the Arc B series. Also, let me know what you think about the B580 in the comment section below. I'll be sure to read all of your feedback. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, also subscribe, because we will be doing some big benchmark comparisons with this GPU, probably against the RTX 4060 to start off, something like that, because that's probably one of the more popular entry-level GPUs, let's say. Anyway, more content coming up, so make sure you subscribe. Also, you can hit the join button if you want to become a Harbour Unboxed member. We also have Patreon. You'll get access to our exclusive Discord server, behind-the-scenes content, monthly live streams, and Q&A stuff. But anyway, that is going to do it for this one. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.